spooky place.
Welcome back to the spooky place, where the stories don't just scare you, they claim you. They don't fade with the embers, they fester, slither, and wait. Tonight, we don't just tell a scary story, we unleash one. A tale so twisted, so deeply unsettling, that once it reaches your ears, it clings to you. It burrows beneath your skin, coils around your thoughts, and festers in the silence. And the worst part? This story doesn't end when the fire dies. It spreads, it watches, it listens. And if you're not careful, if you let it in too deep, it won't just haunt you, it will claim you. So listen closely if you dare, but don't be surprised if, in the dead of night, you feel the whisper of something cold just inches from your ear. The Crying Woman. The man stirred in his sleep, his eyelids fluttering open as the sound of soft crying seeped into his consciousness. It was faint, almost like a distant echo, but it was there, a mournful, trembling sob that seemed to come from just outside his bedroom door. He lay still for a moment, his heart pounding in his chest, trying to convince himself it was just a dream. But the crying persisted, growing louder, more desperate. He turned to his wife, Emma, who lay beside him, her breathing slow and steady. She was fast asleep, her face peaceful, untouched by the eerie sound. Reluctantly, he swung his legs over the side of the bed, his feet hitting the cold wooden floor. The crying grew louder, more insistent, as if whoever, or whatever, was out there knew he was awake. The man hesitated, his hand hovering over the doorknob. The hallway beyond was pitch black, the only light coming from the faint glow of the moon through the bedroom window. He took a deep breath, turned the knob, and pulled the door open. The crying stopped. The hallway was empty. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and the silence that followed was deafening. He stepped out, his bare feet padding softly on the floor, and peered into the darkness. Nothing, no one, just the faint outline of the family photos lining the walls, their faces obscured by shadows. "Hello," he called out, his voice trembling. There was no response. Shaking his head, he turned back to the bedroom, only to freeze in his tracks. Emma was sitting up in bed, her eyes wide with fear, her face pale as a ghost. She stared at him, her lips trembling as she whispered, "You heard it too?" His blood ran cold. "You heard it." She nodded, her hands clutching the blanket tightly. It was a child, a little girl. She was crying for her mommy. The man's stomach churned. They didn't have any children. The house had been empty when they bought it, a fixer-upper in a quiet neighborhood. The previous owners had left in a hurry, the realtor had said, but he hadn't thought much of it at the time. "It's just the wind," he said, though he didn't believe it himself. Or the pipes. Old houses make strange noises. Emma didn't look convinced. She glanced toward the hallway, her eyes darting nervously. It didn't sound like the pipes. He climbed back into bed, pulling the covers over them both, but sleep didn't come easily. The crying didn't return that night, but the memory of it lingered, a dark cloud hanging over them. The next night, it happened again. This time, the crying was louder, more urgent. The man shot up in bed, his heart racing, and looked over at Emma. She was already awake, her eyes wide with terror. "It's back," she whispered. He didn't hesitate this time. He grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand and stormed out into the hallway. The determined to find the source of the sound. The crying grew louder as he moved, echoing through the house. But no matter where he looked, there was nothing, no one. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the crying stopped. The man stood in the middle of the hallway, his flashlight beam sweeping across the walls. That's when he noticed it, something he hadn't seen before. One of the family photos was crooked, as if it had been knocked out of place. He reached up to straighten it, but as he did, his fingers brushed against something wet. He pulled his hand back, his stomach turning as he saw the dark, sticky substance coating his fingers. Blood. He stumbled backward, his heart pounding, and nearly dropped the flashlight. The photo was of a little girl, her face pale, her eyes hollow. She hadn't been in the photo before. He was sure of it, and yet, there she was, staring out at him with a look of pure despair. "Emma," he shouted, his voice cracking. "Emma, come here." But when he turned back toward the bedroom, she wasn't there. The bed was empty, the sheets thrown aside. His heart leapt into his throat as he ran back into the room, calling her name. No response, and then he heard it, a soft, melodic humming coming from downstairs. It was a tune he didn't recognize, but it sent a chill down his spine. He grabbed the flashlight and rushed down the stairs, his mind racing with fear. The living room was dark, the furniture casting long, eerie shadows. The humming grew louder as he approached the kitchen, and that's when he saw her. Emma was standing in the middle of the room, her back to him, her arms hanging limply at her sides. She was humming softly, her voice trembling. "Emma," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. She turned slowly, and his blood ran cold. Her eyes were blank, her face expressionless, and then she smiled, a wide, unnatural grin that sent a wave of terror through him. "She's here," Emma whispered, her voice not her own. "She's been waiting for us." Before he could react, the crying started again, louder than ever, coming from all around him. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows twisting and writhing like living things. And then he saw her, the little girl from the photo, standing in the corner of the room, her eyes filled with tears. "Mommy," the girl whispered, her voice echoing through the house. "Why did you leave me?" The man stumbled backward, his mind reeling. He looked at Emma, but she was no longer smiling. Her face was twisted in horror, her eyes wide with recognition. "No," Emma whispered, her voice trembling. "It can't be. She's dead. We left her. We left her behind." The man's heart stopped. Memories flooded back. Memories he had buried deep. Memories of a life they had tried to forget. A car accident. A little girl in the back seat. They had walked away, leaving her behind, too afraid to face what they had done. The girl stepped forward, her small hand reaching out. "You left me," she said, her voice filled with sorrow. "But I found you." The man opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The walls closed in, the shadows swallowing him whole. And the last thing he saw was the little girl's face, her tears falling like rain. When the police arrived the next morning, the house was empty. No sign of the couple, no sign of a struggle. Just a single photo lying on the kitchen floor. A photo of a little girl, her eyes filled with tears, her hand reaching out as if to grab whoever looked at it. And if you listen closely, they say you can still hear the crying. Soft, mournful sobs echoing through the empty halls, a reminder of the family that once lived there, and the little girl who never left. The house stood silent and abandoned, its windows dark and lifeless, as if it were holding its breath. The neighbors avoided it, crossing the street to steer clear of its looming presence. Children dared each other to run up to the porch, but none ever made it past the creaky gate. The story of the missing couple had spread like wildfire, and the house had become a local legend, a place of whispers, shadows, and unanswered questions. But the house wasn't empty. Weeks after the couple's disappearance, a young woman named Claire moved in. She was new to town, a freelance writer looking for a quiet place to work. The house was cheap, too cheap, but she didn't ask questions. She saw the peeling paint and the overgrown yard as charming, a project to make her own. The realtor had been hesitant, warning her about the history of the place, but Claire brushed it off. She didn't believe in ghosts. The first night was quiet, too quiet. Claire unpacked her boxes, humming to herself, and settled into the master bedroom. She fell asleep easily, exhausted from the move, but her dreams were restless. She dreamed of a little girl standing at the foot of her bed, her face pale and her eyes hollow. The girl reached out, her small hand trembling, and whispered, "Help me." Claire woke with a start, her heart pounding. The room was dark, the air thick and heavy. She reached for the lamp on the nightstand, but it wouldn't turn on. The power was out. She fumbled for her phone, using its flashlight to illuminate the room. Everything was as she had left it, but the air felt wrong, like she wasn't alone. She heard it then, a soft, rhythmic tapping. It was coming from the hallway. Tap, 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 like fingernails against wood. Claire's breath caught in her throat. She told herself it was the house settling, the wind, anything but what her gut was screaming at her. She grabbed the baseball bat she kept by the bed and crept to the door, her heart pounding in her ears. The hallway was empty, but the tapping continued. It was coming from the end of the hall, near the staircase. Claire stepped forward, her flashlight beam trembling as it swept across the walls. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, as if whatever was making it knew she was coming. And then it stopped. Claire froze, her breath visible in the cold air. The house was silent again, but the silence was worse than the tapping. She turned to go back to her room, but something caught her eye, a shadow moving at the edge of her vision. She spun around, her flashlight beam slicing through the darkness, but there was nothing there, just the family photos on the wall. She frowned. One of the photos was crooked, just like the man had noticed weeks before. She reached up to straighten it, but as she did, she felt something cold and wet on her fingers. She pulled her hand back, her stomach turning as she saw the dark, sticky substance coating her skin. Blood. She dropped the flashlight, her hands trembling, and backed away from the wall. The photo was of a little girl, her face pale, her eyes hollow. Claire didn't remember seeing it before. The girl's lips were parted, as if she were about to speak, and her hand was reaching out, her fingers curled as if to grab something, or someone. Claire turned and ran back to her room, slamming the door shut behind her. She leaned against it, her chest heaving, and tried to calm herself. It was just an old house, she told herself. Old houses had quirks, strange noises, creaky floors, nothing to be afraid of. But deep down, she knew better. The next morning, Claire woke to the sound of birds chirping outside her window. The sun streamed through the curtains, and the house felt warm and inviting. She almost convinced herself that the night before had been a bad dream, until she saw the blood on her fingers. She washed her hands, scrubbing until her skin was raw, but the memory of the photo lingered. She decided to investigate, determined to prove to herself that there was nothing to fear. She started in the hallway, examining the photos one by one. They were all normal, smiling faces, happy memories. Except for one. The photo of the little girl was gone. Claire's stomach churned. She searched the hallway, the living room, even the basement, but the photo was nowhere to be found. She was about to give up when she heard it, a soft, melodic humming coming from the kitchen. Her blood ran cold. She grabbed the baseball bat and crept toward the sound, her heart pounding in her chest. The humming grew louder as she approached, and she could make out the tune now, a lullaby, sweet and haunting. She stepped into the kitchen, her breath catching in her throat. The room was empty, but the humming was everywhere, echoing off the walls. And then she saw it, a small handprint on the counter, smeared with blood. Claire stumbled backward, her mind racing. She needed to get out, to call someone, anyone. But as she turned to leave, the humming stopped, and the house was plunged into silence. And then she heard it, a soft, trembling voice coming from behind her. "Help me." Claire turned slowly, her heart pounding, and saw her. The little girl from the photo, standing in the corner of the kitchen, her eyes filled with tears. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her dress was tattered and stained with blood. "You can see me," the girl whispered, her voice trembling. "You can help me." Claire opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The girl stepped forward, her small hand reaching out, and Claire felt a cold, icy grip on her wrist. "Don't leave me," the girl pleaded, her tears falling like rain. "Please." And then the room went dark. When Claire woke, she was lying on the kitchen floor, the sunlight streaming through the windows. The house was silent, the air warm and still. She sat up, her head pounding, and looked around. There was no sign of the little girl, no blood, no handprint, just a faint echo of a lullaby in her mind. She told herself it was a dream, a hallucination brought on by stress. But deep down, she knew the truth. The house wasn't empty, and the little girl wasn't going to let her leave. Not until she found what she was looking for. Claire tried to shake off the experience, convincing herself it was just her imagination running wild. But over the next few days, strange things kept happening. Objects would move on their own. The temperature in certain rooms would drop suddenly, and the humming would return at night, soft and persistent, like a lullaby meant only for her. She began to research the house's history, digging through old records and newspaper archives. What she found made her blood run cold. Decades ago, a family had lived there, a couple and their young daughter. The girl had gone missing under mysterious circumstances, and the parents had left in a hurry, never to return. The case was never solved. One night, as Claire sat in the living room, the air grew icy, and the little girl appeared again, her hollow eyes fixed on Claire. "You have to find it," the girl whispered, her voice trembling. "Under the floor, in my room." Claire's heart raced as she followed the girl's gaze to the staircase. She grabbed a flashlight and a crowbar, her hands shaking as she pried up the floorboards in the upstairs bedroom. Beneath them, she found a small, rusted box. Inside was a faded photograph of the girl, a tattered doll, and a handwritten note that read, "I'm sorry. We didn't mean to leave you." As Claire read the words, the girl's voice echoed in her mind, softer now, almost peaceful. "Thank you." The house fell silent, the oppressive weight lifting as if the girl had finally found what she needed. Claire moved out the next day, leaving the box and its contents on the porch as she drove away. The house still stands, silent and empty, but the crying has stopped. Some say the little girl finally found peace. Others say she's still waiting, watching for the next person who might hear her whispers in the dark. And if you listen closely on a quiet night, you might just hear the faint hum of a lullaby, a reminder that some stories never truly end. Thank you all for watching. Please like and subscribe for more scary stories.